How often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? And Jesus answers, not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. I remember hearing this as a child and being very upset because my brother and I fought a lot. He had that younger sibling gift for provoking me that I think must be genetically imprinted. He knew how to say just the right thing, or look at me just the right way, or even just stand in a room in just the right way that would send me over the edge and send us into a fist fight. And he always did it on purpose. That's what seemed obvious to me at the time. And I remember hearing this passage from the Gospel of Matthew and wondering, have we gotten to 77 yet? When do I get to stop forgiving this guy? Imagine my shock when I learned, as I told the kids just a few minutes ago, that it might actually be translated 70 times 7 times. 490 times. And poor little 9-year-old Drew is asking, "Oh Lord, how long?" We immediately assume, though, when we hear this, that the focus of the story is on us as individuals. We hear, I have to forgive. I have to be the better person. I have to be good enough and forgive these jerks. But this story carries some emphasis on us as individuals and some emphasis elsewhere. Some emphasis on who forgives us. This is not a story about keeping score of how many times a person has wronged you. This is a story about forgiveness that is free, forgiveness that is abundant, forgiveness that extends beyond our capacity to forgive. This is a story about the way God forgives us. And its focus is on the never-ending fountain of God's mercy and forgiveness. We can choose to dive into the fountain of mercy and forgiveness, or we can refuse. But Jesus is calling us to pay attention to that fountain. The hero of this story, if there is one, is the person in charge, the Lord of this estate, who forgives so abundantly. And we'll hear just how abundantly in a moment. It's a story of a king and someone who would be massively powerful in the time that this story was originally told. And then in the ancient Near East, he has lots of servants, slaves, as it is written in the Gospel of Matthew. It is important to point out that at the time this story was written, any person who worked for a king would have been referred to by the word slave, no matter what kind of work they were doing as a stable boy or as a chief administrator. So this king's doing an audit. Always good to do your audit. He's looking through all of his accounts with his administrators, and he finds that one of them owes him a lot of money. 10,000 talents. How much is that for us today? Well, an average worker at that time would have been paid 1 denarii a day. That was a separate coin. Now, a talent is 6,000 denarii. And this guy owes 10,000 of those. It's impossible to translate biblical numbers perfectly, and a lot of the time biblical numbers are not really about the numerical values anyway, but about what they might represent symbolically. But let's take a crack at it. We base this on the current minimum wage of the United States, $7.25 an hour. 8 hours a day, I think that's $58 times 6,000 times 10,000. This guy owes about $3.5 billion with a B. This is how we know that the word that we see slave does not simply refer to field hands, but also to the people with access to $3.5 billion. which, by the way, comes to about 1.9% of Elon Musk's net worth. The king is enraged, and rightly so. He would be within his rights under the legal system of the day to execute this person for refusing, or for borrowing so extravagantly and getting into a situation where he could never pay it back. He threatens him. He does worse, actually, than execute him, I think. He threatens to sell the man and his wife and children into slavery elsewhere. This king wants to torment him for what he has done. But the guy appeals for mercy, both for himself and for his family, and that changes the king's mind. He says, give me a chance to pay it back. That is not going to happen. Right? He is not going to pay back $3.5 billion. And the king knows that. But he has mercy on him anyway. Lets the man go, forgives his debt. This is a ridiculous level of generosity and forgiveness. The servant leaves the palace, lucky to be alive, and then comes across another servant who also owes him money, 100 denarii, about $5,800, a much more manageable debt. Now, our guy here just got out of a $3.5 billion debt. Might as well be a large bank in 2009. He just got out of a massive debt. Compared to that, $5,800 is nothing. But he grabs the guy by the throat and demands that he pay up. The borrower pleads for mercy, just as the first servant did before. But he refuses, and he has him thrown into a debtor's prison until he pays his debt, which is also a ridiculous idea, that you would somehow make enough money in the prison to pay it off. But that is our situation. Two men, both of them on the hook for money. One is spared and forgiven this astronomical and unpayable debt. The other one is not spared and thrown into prison. The king intervenes, of course, and flips the table on these two. But when we look at those numbers, what stands out about this story? What is the most remarkable element of it? It's the king's generosity. It's the king's willingness to forgive $3.5 billion in debt. It is over the top, makes him look like a fool. And to the original audience, who would hear this 10,000 talents and immediately recognize what a massive amount of money it is, the takeaway would be awe at the king's generosity. It would be amazement at that fountain of forgiveness that never seems to end. And the first servant who borrows so much money, he chose not to jump into the fountain of forgiveness when he had the opportunity. He chooses to accept forgiveness for himself but refuse it to others, and he's punished for it. But the point of the story is the fountain. And that is a good lesson for us to remember. That when I am hurt, when I am frustrated, when I am let down by other people, I have the option of remembering the fountain of forgiveness that has overflowed over me. I have been washed in that fountain, and I have been forgiven. Will the forgiveness I have received shape me, mold me, form me so that I become part of it? So that I am an instrument of that fountain? So that I am a manifestation of its overflowing? Or will I refuse? And just stand there, accept forgiveness for myself, and refuse it to anyone else? Forgiveness is scary. After all, it is tempting to refuse it. When we forgive others, it opens us up to be again hurt by them. And if our hearts and our minds are stuck in our own pain and we don't want to let go of the grudge, then we don't want to let go of our hurt and give them the power to hurt us once again. But if our hearts are turned to the forgiveness that we have received, it can change the way we see others. If we can accept forgiveness for ourselves and stay mindful of just how much we are forgiven on a daily basis, then it makes it a lot harder to refuse forgiveness to others. Now, whenever I talk about forgiveness, I always pause and point out that there's a difference between forgiving and enduring abuse. God does not call us to be doormats. We are meant to stand up for ourselves when people hurt us. That actually is what happens just before this in the Gospel of Matthew, the sermon I preached last week, about what to do when there's a conflict in the church when a person hurts you. And Jesus outlines a system where you go to the person individually, and if that doesn't work, you bring friends, etc. Very clearly, he is not advocating for people to allow themselves to be taken advantage of or abused. We don't just take it, and we don't just accept a cheap false apology as a grounds for forgiveness. But we do still stand in the overflowing waters of the fountain of mercy and forgiveness. And if we allow that to wash over us, then we can find the strength, not just to forgive, but to hold others to account in an honest way that enables true forgiveness and reconciliation to happen. The point of the story is the fountain and what it does for us and how it can change us and what we do for others. The point of the story is mercy, and the call of the story is to share it with the world. Amen.